The demographic crisis has become one of the defining concerns of the 21st century, often described as the climate change of the right wing. Public figures like Elon Musk, Peter Zeihan, and others warn that collapsing population growth in developed countries poses a greater threat to global stability than war, inflation, or even climate change itself. Some of the lowest fertility rates in the world are found in Northeast Asia, including South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and China. At the same time, these nations achieve some of the fastest and most sustained economic growth in modern history. In just a few generations, they transformed from impoverished agrarian societies into advanced industrial powerhouses. Despite severe shortages of natural resources like arable land, minerals, and energy. In fact, some of these countries are so geographically constrained that they even lack sufficient flat land for housing or infrastructure. So, is there a connection between these two facts? Did the very policies that fueled Asia's economic miracle also plant the seeds of demographic collapse? In his book, How Asia Works, journalist Joe Studwell outlines a three-step framework that explains how Northeast Asian countries, namely Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and later China, achieved rapid and sustained economic development. First, land reform. The first step was radical land reform. In the aftermath of war and colonial rule, land was either expropriated from large landholders, often without full compensation, or purchased by the state at low prices, then redistributed in small plots to the families who actually worked the land. The result was a nation of smallholder farmers with a direct stake in their output. Unlike large estates where labor was often poorly incentivized, small family plots fostered intense labor effort, productivity, and high rural savings, all prerequisites for later industrial growth. This model was successfully implemented in Japan after World War II, in South Korea and Taiwan during the 1950s under U.S. influence, and in China through more coercive means during the Maoist era. Second, export-oriented industrialization. The second phase was the construction of an export-oriented industrial base. Unlike the import substitution industrialization, ISI model adopted in much of Southeast Asia, Latin America, and parts of Africa, where domestic industries were sheltered from international competition. Northeast Asian governments demanded that their industries eventually compete on global markets. Tariff protections existed, but only temporarily, and only for firms that showed export performance and technological progress. The state played a central role in identifying strategic sectors, such as steel, shipbuilding, electronics, and automobiles, channeling credit and subsidies toward them, and disciplining firms that failed to deliver results. Currency devaluation was used strategically to keep exports competitive. Success in the global marketplace, not domestic monopolies, became the measure of industrial viability. Over time, this produced conglomerates like the Zaibatsu in Japan and the Chaebols in South Korea, which, though state-guided, competed aggressively on price and quality. Third, financial repression and directed credit. The third component was strict control over the financial system. Rather than developing broad capital markets, such as large-scale stock exchanges or bond markets, the state maintained dominance over commercial banking, which is easier to control and align with national priorities. Consumer credit was discouraged or outright repressed. Instead, capital was funneled toward long-term, productivity-enhancing investment. Interest rates were often kept artificially low, and access to financing was conditional on government industrial policy. This model stood in stark contrast to the liberal financial reforms promoted by the IMF and World Bank in other regions during the same period. In Northeast Asia, finance served production first and consumption second, or never. While the West often grew rich on the back of abundant natural resources, colonial extraction, and global finance, the countries of Northeast Asia had no such luxuries. South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and even China, despite its territorial size, began their ascent among the world's poorest nations in terms of per capita natural wealth. China, for instance, has less than 0.9 acres of arable land per person, far below the global average. Japan is almost entirely dependent on imports for energy and food. South Korea possesses no significant fossil fuel reserves, limited farmland, and few minerals. To survive, these countries had no choice but to trade, and not just trade commodities, but add value to everything they exported. This imperative to climb the value chain shaped every aspect of their development model. The machine of national progress had to keep advancing, faster, more productive, more educated, more efficient, constantly moving upstream in global markets. Success depended not just on policy, but on the transformation of society itself into an engine of discipline and output. This meant long working hours, often among the highest in the OECD. In 2022, South Korea averaged 1,915 working hours per year, hundreds more than many Western countries. Intense educational pressure. The South Korean Hagwon system demands students attend private academies after school, often until 10 or 11 p.m., in pursuit of test scores that determine social mobility. Delayed consumption and material gratification. In order to finance investment and maintain export competitiveness, wages were kept artificially low through financial repression and labor market controls. Household consumption as a share of GDP remained below 55% in most of these economies, compared to over 65% in the US. A culture of national sacrifice. Citizens were not just encouraged but expected to subordinate individual desires to national goals, to study harder, work longer, marry later, and save more. This model produced extraordinary economic results, but it did so by converting human time, energy, and potential into raw input. In effect, the machine was fed with people, not just their labor, but their youth, their time, their family life, and in some cases, even their desire to have children. As growth became a national religion, personal life became a luxury, and as the rewards of progress accumulated, so did its social costs, setting the stage for the demographic decline now visible across the region. The economic miracle of Northeast Asia came at a profound human cost, one that would only become fully visible decades later. As these societies pushed the limits of human productivity, they also systematically eroded the foundations of family life. Today, Northeast Asia is the global epicenter of demographic decline. South Korea, 0.72 children per woman, 2023, the lowest fertility rate ever recorded in peacetime. Taiwan, 0.87, 2023. China, approximately 1.0 after dropping from 1.7 in just a decade. Japan, 1.3, stable only because it collapsed earlier. For context, a fertility rate of 2.1 is required for population replacement. These countries are not just shrinking, they are aging faster than any societies in modern history. In South Korea, for example, 1 in 5 people is already over 65. By 2070, the country's population is projected to shrink by 40%. But this is not just a matter of numbers. The collapse is rooted in systemic social and economic pressures. Time poverty. The long working hours and intense educational demands discussed earlier leave little time for courtship, marriage, or parenting. A 2022 survey by Statistics Korea found that over 60% of young adults cite lack of time and work-life balance as key reasons for delaying or avoiding children. Cost of parenthood. Raising a child in an ultra-competitive environment is no longer a matter of basic sustenance. It's a strategic, high-stakes investment. Private education, Hagwons in Korea, cram schools in Japan and Taiwan, housing near top schools, and job market preparation impose costs comparable to college tuition from kindergarten. In South Korea, the estimated cost of raising a child to adulthood exceeds $250,000, discouraging even middle-class families from having more than one child, if any. Psychological exhaustion. A culture that celebrates discipline and sacrifice often treats emotional well-being as secondary. mental health issues among youth are surging. In South Korea, suicide is the leading cause of death among people aged 10 to 30. Erosion of the social fabric, marriage rates have plummeted. Births outside of marriage remain rare due to conservative social norms, but traditional family structures are disintegrating. A growing segment of the population is simply opting out of relationships entirely, not out of rebellion, but fatigue. Unlike in Western nations, where fertility decline is sometimes cushioned by immigration or flexible family structures, Northeast Asia offers no such buffers. These societies built their prosperity on maximum output from shrinking human capital, and now face the consequences. What was once a model of growth through sacrifice has become a cycle of stagnation through exhaustion. In economic terms, the Northeast Asian model is one of the most successful development stories in history. But beneath the indicators of wealth, high GDP, advanced technology, global brands, lies a paradox. The richer these societies become, the fewer people want to live in them. Across Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and China, we now see a version of what demographers call the fertility trap. As societies grow more educated, urbanized, and economically advanced, fertility rates tend to fall. But in Northeast Asia, the decline has become self-reinforcing and structurally embedded. These are nations that won the global race for development, and yet many of them are now facing what could be called post-growth demographic collapse. A slow, silent unraveling of the very societies that industrialize fastest and most effectively. Meanwhile, countries that develop more gradually, with less intense industrial policies and more flexible labor or family structures, maintain relatively higher fertility. The United States, despite recent declines, still maintains around 1.6 to 1.7 children per woman, thanks in part to immigration and cultural heterogeneity. Indonesia and Vietnam, both pursuing hybrid models of growth, show higher birth rates and more stable family formation. So the question emerges, was it worth it? Was the economic miracle, the growth, the infrastructure, the global competitiveness, worth the human cost if it leaves behind shrinking, aging societies with no next generation to inherit the gains? And beyond that, could it have been done differently? Could these nations have industrialized without suppressing wages, delaying consumption, exhausting their youth, and turning the family into an economic burden rather than a unit of support? This is not an argument against growth or against ambition, but rather a reckoning with its trade-offs. Northeast Asia chose a model that prioritized speed, discipline, and national survival in a hostile geopolitical environment. And it worked. But it may have succeeded too well and too fast for its own long-term viability. In the end, the machine kept running. But when the work bell rang for the next shift, no one showed up to take over.